So, Mary Gallagher has been a native fish conservation biologist with Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife for more than 20 years. She works with many species, but brook trout are near and dear to her heart. As a part of her job, she also coordinates stream restoration work as well as the Maine Stream Temperature Monitoring Group. Welcome, Mary, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll pass it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. And I, again, apologize for not having an effective presentation the last time and having some network issues that prevented completing the program last time. So we're going to give it a go on this go round, and hopefully we can get through it. And I look forward to some good questions at the end. But yes, I'm Mary Gallagher, and I'm going to talk tonight about our wild brook trout here in Maine. I'm not a biased opinion at all. And when I say things like they're the most beautiful fish in the world, and they certainly are. Many of you probably know some of this stuff already, but just so that we're all on, kind of on the same page, I'm just going to start off with a little basics about what a brook trout is and how they live their lives. They're actually a char. In the grand scheme of classification of fishes and taxonomy of fishes, they're actually a char or a member of the genus Salvelinus. And it was a species that was originally described in 1814. So they're a well-known species and have been well-known to science for quite some time. And here in Maine, we have all known life history tactics occurring in our state. We're very fortunate that way. We have brook trout statewide that manifest lifestyles that can be termed patadromous, anadromous, and non-migratory. Most of you are probably familiar with the term anadromous in the world of fisheries, and this refers to fish that live part of their life cycle in freshwater and migrate and live part of their life cycle in the marine world. Some of our brook trout in the coastal zone do display that tactic, but most of our fish are more termed appropriately as patadromous. And this is a species of fish that does sometimes extensive movements or migrations entirely within freshwater systems. They can be among freshwater habitats like lakes and rivers, but it's all freshwater, but they can move great distances. And in Maine, even, we have recorded movements of some of our brook trout, and some of them move great mileage in a single season. From 35 to 72 miles within a river network is not unusual. And we have recorded this in fish tagging studies at different times throughout history. As a species of fish, they're relatively short-lived. Most of our fish here in Maine, wild fish, when we age them, 4 or 5 years old is about typical for an older age class fish, although it is occasionally known to happen that we have found fish that are 6, 7, 8. And I think in the scientific literature and up in Canada, they can have even been aged out to 9 and 10 years old. In the grand scheme of fishes, that's relatively a short-lived species. Many fishes can live decades, or some of them even are now being aged out to be in 100 years plus. So just so you know, but not brook trout, they're short-lived. They occupy and thrive in diverse habitat types, from small streams to large rivers, lakes and ponds, and even coastal habitats in using estuarine conditions at times. And we have all of that happening here in Maine in different parts of the state. The big kicker with brook trout is they like it cold, and this is the key to maintaining healthy, robust populations of wild brook trout wherever you are in the species range. But they have to have access to cold water, usually in the neighborhood of, say, 20 degrees C or lower all the time. And if they can't find those temperatures where they actually live, that's one of the reasons why they may have to move great distances. As summer temperatures increase and more likely in more parts of the range, they're needing to move to find that cool water to survive the summer and into the fall. And just as a reminder, about 25 degrees C, 77 degrees, and this is water temperature we're talking, 77 degrees Fahrenheit is about the upper thermal tolerance. And if they can't escape that, they will die. They're not picky eaters. They're very diverse in what they will eat. If they can catch it and swallow it, they're going to eat it. That's generally the case with brook trout. So we often refer to them as ecological generalists because they have this wide-ranging diversity of habitat preferences and diet preferences across the species range, and it's all the same species. It's just individuals manifesting different behaviors and preferences. But they're also highly adaptable to new conditions, new environments, as long as they're getting that thermal temperature that they need. They're highly plastic in that they can adapt to a variety of conditions rather readily relative to most other fishes. Now, annual life cycle of brook trout is pretty consistent, range wide. They spawn in the fall. These are fall spawning fish, and that's what we see here in Maine. And they spawn in loose gravels within stream systems and sometimes lake shores, but it's always fresh water. We're finding them always spawning in fresh water. Even our coastal populations, they'll return to freshwater streams and spawn in the freshwater streams in the fall, just like everybody else. And over that winter, the eggs incubate in the gravels where they were laid and hatch in midwinter. The larvae feed off of their yolk through that winter and swim up in the early spring when temperatures are first starting to rise and ice is starting to melt. The young fish in that first year tend to occupy what we refer to as riffle habitat in streams for the most part. These are smaller scale streams with a little bit of current and flow to them, but they still keep. Hello?
Oh, Mary, we lost your sound for just a second. Can you try coming back on? You just muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I saw the Zoom icon blink out. So back on the life history or annual cycle of brook trout, the young fish in that first year occupy riffle habitat that always keys in on good cover, overhanging veg with a little bit of flow to it. This is a key habitat criterion for the little ones. As they grow and age and get larger in body size, they do key in on a different habitat type, which is very important for maintaining a robust, healthy brook trout population. The adult animals prefer and need, to some extent, deeper water habitat, and they usually just love and key in on good cover elements, lots of overhanging veg, anything that's going to help them hide from the predators of the world that are out there. Oops, next slide. So what is good brook trout habitat? This is something that we talk a lot about within inland fisheries and wildlife, but because we have such a diversity of brook trout forms and types and preferences within our state, we're really keyed in on just being able to provide or make sure that they have access to a wide range of habitat types and preferences that are out there. So maintaining adequate microhabitat diversity across the gamut is pretty key to maintaining robust populations. Of course, you need cold water or the ability to access it, especially in summer season or in early fall when needed. So we need to have open river networks so these fish can freely move around. Ample cover elements, because brook trout are secretive, and especially for anybody who's an angler of trout, you know that you're going to be dropping your fly where you're going to find some rocks and wood and other hidey holes in the stream system. That's where your trout are going to be. And of course, food, everybody has to eat, and the more the merrier on that front. The other key kicker about brook trout here in Maine is our fish in this state in general have evolved and acclimated to our habitats in the relative lack of other strong competitors. This is where we get into the idea or the concept where some of our newly invading species entering the state, like some bass and northern pike and things like that. These are strong competitors within the fish realm, and brook trout definitely don't particularly care for their presence around them. So the key for maintaining brook trout across the landscape of Maine is going to be maintaining open river networks and maintaining that habitat diversity and access to pools and cold water habitat when they need it. So the ability to be flexible. across the season, and I'm talking the whole year, because their preferences and their needs change in accordance with the year, as well as what the streams and the habitats are doing, as well as where they're at in their particular life cycle. Now, this is not a great map, and I admit that, but it highlights what we're talking about, the need for brook trout to be able to move extensive distances. This is the mapped locations of one radio tagged fish a few years ago when we were doing a tagging study in Western Maine. And this is the Magalloway River system right here, with Aziscohos Lake up here, the lake up on the north end here. This is on Bagog Lake down at the south end. This is the Dead Diamond River that extends over into New Hampshire. So this is kind of a border area with our sister state to the west, New Hampshire. But this fish was tagged right here near Gate Camp at position number 1. And this would have been in the spring. And then the next time it was detected was up here, just a little bit upstream from Gate Camp. And then the next time would be position 3, and this would have been a few days later after that, is over here in the Magalloway River in Maine. And then position 4, it was caught or detected way up here at the base of Aziscohos Lake, at the north end of the Magalloway River up here. Stayed there for a few spells, a few weeks, positions 4 through 12, and then position 13, in the span of just like a couple of days, this fish was found all the way over, way up at the north end of the Dead Diamond River, way upstream on the Dead Diamond. And then for position 15, just a couple days after that, is way back up near Aziscohos Lake again, up in the top of the Magalloway River. Spent another couple of observations up there, 16 through 18, 19 through 29, spent the summer basically. There's a series of deep, really nice brook trout pools up in this section of Magalloway River, and a lot of our tagged fish in this study spent the summer there. And because there's always some nice cold water coming out of the base of Aziscohos Lake. So, and then as fall is coming along and fish are starting to think about spawning, it migrated a little bit further downstream for positions 30 through 33. And this is an area where we have a known spawning location in one of the tributaries to the Magalloway out here. So this fish spent spawning season there. And then as winter is coming on, after spawning season, it dropped down back to the Gate Camp area. And then eventually, as winter really came on, it was down here at Bagog Lake and spent the winter there. So over the course of a season, this is an extensive movement of this one fish in excess of 75 miles, which is pretty spectacular for a brook trout. So we know we have a spectacular, amazing fish that occurs here in Maine. But what do we know about what happened in the past? Because what we see in our trout populations is the result of what basically has been occurring in the past. Well, historically and evolutionarily, brook trout are a North American fish. The heart of their distribution is really Canada. And us here in the United States are really kind of at the southern extent of their natural range. This map on the left here is the natural range of brook trout. So all this kind of pinky area is the historical or native distribution of the species. Out in the west, we do have brook trout now occurring out there, but they are non-native out in the west. They've been deliberately stocked in many areas of the Rockies and in other parts of the western states for sport fish enhancement reasons, but actually they have become problematic for some of the salmonids that are native to that area. So they're often considered invasive in the West. And the one thing I will just point out with this section of the lower peninsula of Michigan, when this map that I have here was actually developed, it was thought at the time that brook trout were probably not native and had been the result of past stocking events in that part of Michigan. But I think the thinking by our Michigan compatriots now are thinking a little differently, and that brook trout are probably native, at least in some of the rivers and streams in that part of Michigan. So I just wanted to let you know that's the one error in this graphic, and I probably should get an update on a map for that. But we've all heard the stories about past brook trout catches. We've heard and seen the photos of some really nice fatties coming out of places like Moosehead Lake at various points in time. And this is a photo from 1895 of a nice creel catch up in the Moosehead Lake area. Real nice brook trout. We've seen the stringers of just a few anglers in their daily catch of being many, many fish, many more than what is allowed now as our harvest regulations on a daily basis for sure. And I could have put up photos that were a lot worse than that one than that is shown here, but we've all seen them. And of course, we've all heard the stories of the big lunkers in places like Rangeley Lake that just don't seem to be around, or they just don't seem to display that size range any longer. And there are reasons for that, and I can't say that we know for sure why, but certainly for sure, overharvest, at least in some areas of the state, is a relic of our past and is something that we have to come to grips with and realize was occurring at that point in time. But in addition to heavy fishery take, we know that we've done some things to brook trout habitat that have not been the best, especially for the fish themselves. Of course, Maine has an extensive history in our forest lands of commercial forestry and logging operations. And for a lot of Maine's history, our rivers and streams were used as the transport mechanism for moving logs down to the mills and the ports closer to the coast. So a lot of activities were done to the rivers and streams to facilitate the movements of those logs. And you're hard pressed to find a stream in Maine, especially in the interior forest lands, that does not bear the scars of these actions from the past. Things like just extensive log driving and log piling up to move them all systematically. Lots of dams built in many areas to help move the movement of water and logs to keep them systematically moving downstream. Streams were literally bulldozed in many areas to straighten them, remove the structure so that logs could move downstream much more effectively. We have log driving dams all over the place in some areas of the state. These were constructed for a variety of reasons, but it was almost always associated with the needing to store water and then blow it all so that there was plenty of water to keep those logs moving downstream. And a lot of dynamite was used in the past to facilitate a lot of these actions, whether it's to keep those logs moving downstream or to physically remove some of the boulders and other in-stream structure that might be an impediment to moving those logs downstream. So a lot of this stuff happened in the past, and it wasn't just our forest lands. We had some actions in the past in our other brook trout country that did things that is not to the best of brook trout habitat's liking. We have dams constructed in our main stem rivers for a variety of reasons. Again, it's usually associated with mill activities, and nowadays it's more associated with power generation. But of course, and then of course, as you get closer to our coastal zones, you have the large textile mills, not only producing and diverting water, but also sometimes being major sources of pollutants. We have our agricultural lands in various parts of the state, but most notably up in the eastern side of Aroostook County. And this is an interesting photo I like to show in the middle here on the bottom from Springbrook Mapleton, because this was a photo taken by one of our now retired fishery biologists back in the late 1960s. This would have been before the Cold Water Act was implemented. And this was a drum of some sort of horrible, nasty chemical with big skull and crossbones insignia on this label, just sitting on the bank of this stream, and it's just like this yellow fluid draining out of it directly into the river. And these types of things happened for sure in the past, and probably more than we care to acknowledge or realize. And of course, dams of all sizes everywhere for a variety of reasons. So what have all these actions resulted in? Well, our current status of wild brook trout in the state of Maine is reflected in the map here. And again, this is to some extent, based on our survey information and where we know we're managing for and actually find wild trout when we're out conducting survey efforts. But this is also part of a larger scale East Coast, Northeast United States, larger scale conservation effort called the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But every 10 years, the EBTJV does a range-wide status assessment. So across all of the participating states, we catalog by catchments, by individual watersheds, the presence and absence of wild brook trout. And this is the result for the state of Maine, the last time this was done, which was 2016. And we're compared to the rest of the eastern United States, we're pretty good. And up here in Maine, most people and most brook trout aficionados consider us the best in the United States. But what does that really mean for us? Well, we certainly know we have wild brook trout thriving and doing reasonably well in more than 1,000 of our lakes and ponds statewide, and in an estimated just under 23,000 miles of stream habitat. And this is all based on what we know from our survey information and where we're actively managing the species for sport fisheries. This is not bad, but remember, historically, the entire state of Maine was brook trout habitat, and that is no longer the case. A lot of those white areas in the state really are areas where we no longer have thriving populations of wild brook trout, and we know that. What other tools do we have in our arsenal to do the best we can to conserve and protect the brook trout that we have? Well, many of you are familiar with the state heritage fish designation, and we certainly have this on the books, and wild brook trout are a state listed heritage fish. What does that mean? Well, that means this is a bit of the law that I have on this slide here, if anybody is gung-ho to actually read legislation. But it's a designation that lists lakes and ponds that contain the species within a self-sustaining population that have never been stocked or have never been stocked for at least 25 years based on our records, our stocking history records. So, and what does this all mean? Well, it produces this list of waters, and there's roughly about 500 or 600 of them in the state of Maine for brook trout. And that limits the ability of IF&W to allow the use of live bait for sport fisheries in these lakes and ponds, with a very few exceptions that are stated in the law. And it does not allow the department to perform any stocking, not only of just brook trout, but of any other species as well in those lakes and ponds. So it's a list that's intended to remind us all that the state of Maine takes these resources quite seriously as a heritage to the state of Maine, this particular series of brook trout lakes and ponds. That's one tool we have. What else is going on? Well, we know that we have some issues with habitat condition, especially in our forest lands and some other areas of the state. And maybe we're not driving logs down our rivers and streams anymore and doing those actions in the streams to physically change the channels to effectively move logs. But we are doing things still on our landscape that generally are not the best for brook trout habitat condition reasons. We have invasive species in the state, generally more of a problem in lakes and ponds than in rivers and streams, with a few exceptions, but there's no shortage of bass and pike and muskellunge encroaching into our brook trout habitats in too many areas. We have agriculture still going on in a lot of areas that does have runoff and sedimentation issues associated with it all too often. Here's a photo on the bottom left here of a tributary stream to the Aroostook River up in Aroostook County after a rain event. And look at this sedimentation just kind of flowing into the main stem of the Aroostook subsequent to a heavy rainstorm up near potato country. We have development going on in way too many areas of the state, and this is definitely more of an issue and concern in more of the coastal zone and southern part of the state, but it contributes to habitat fragmentation and deforestation. We have absolute fish passage constraints and barriers all over our state. It's usually in association with our road network as well as the known dams existing on the landscape. Forest practices still are often in many areas doing extensive cutting in the short term of large areas. Um, and this can cause problems with hydrology in those areas. And then we still find old dams that are often long since forgotten in the middle of weird places. All of a sudden you'll be round a river bend and there's a dam there that probably nobody even knows it's still there. And there's lots of those still out there. So all of this going on, what does it mean for trout today? Well, this is what we see across our state is in-stream habitat degradation is a pretty common problem statewide in most of our rivers and streams. And what do I mean by degraded habitat? Is I'm sure you all have walked a river or stream, generally most noticeable in summer low flow conditions, but you see these over widened channels with very little water in most areas. Or you see over widened channels that are super shallow with little to no in-stream structure to provide all that nice cover and hidey hole habitat for brook trout. In our lakes and ponds, it's invasive species and non-native species that are often problematic for brook trout. And one thing I want to just remind everybody about how brook trout respond or react when a new species inhabits or moves into their preferred habitat zone is because brook trout are adaptable and highly mobile. Once a new invader invades, say, their lake and pond, brook trout will just get up and leave. Most people think that you get bass into a pond and bass are going to eat all the brook trout. Generally doesn't happen that way. Bass enter the pond and brook trout will just leave because they can occupy rivers and streams and traverse to new areas and try to find a place to get away from that stressor. So that's generally the effect we see, and it relates to this phenomenon that we often call habitat. I haven't drawn a blank here. Uh, I'll move on, but it's a habitat retraction. That's what I was trying to say. And brook trout are notorious for this. They just continually move out of the system and retract from occupied habitat. And we also have habitat fragmentation due to our road network in the state, whether it's private roads or public roads, the effects are the same. You have a lot of crossings on our river and stream networks, and those crossings are often inadequate for providing fish passage. So over time, you end up with a net loss of occupied habitat. Because once fish are lost from a particular area, they can't get back upstream into some of those areas. So you get a continual loss. Our habitat quality is compromised in many areas of the state and in many ways. And adding to all of that, it's getting warmer. And this is one of the things we also know. And we've known this for a while. We've been recording and monitoring temperatures for quite some time within inland fisheries and wildlife. And this table is some water temperature monitoring conducted by one of our now retired fishery biologists in Western Maine. And this was a report he published within the department about 2009. But this monitoring took place in the mid 2000s. These data loggers were out there recording these temperatures. And Austin Stream once was a great wild brook trout tributary river of the Sandy River system out in Western Maine. And look at these maximum temperatures for 3 months through the summer season, exceeding the thermal threshold for brook trout. So if the trout can't move and go someplace else, they're not going to survive that. And this is one of the things that we know. And these fish have got to be able to go someplace else during the summer season. As a state, we're recording a lot of temperatures statewide. We're a member of a lot of monitoring going on in the Northeast in general. And within the state where we have this statewide interconnected stream temperature monitoring network, and IF&W is a big partner of that effort. We have hundreds of data loggers all over the state. But it's also a function of physical habitat, because keep in mind, back in the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that one of the important habitat features, especially for adult brook trout, the larger bodied, larger sized individuals, is deep water habitat or pools in rivers and streams. And we survey streams within IF&W to get an idea of the quality of the habitat and its availability to our fish that's out there. And one of the things that we see consistently, doesn't seem to really matter what river or stream we're talking about. But when we actually survey these features, we have a low number of pools in general. There are great distances between them. And for the whole river section, it's just a low overall percentage of pool habitat in general. It's just one of those habitat features that, for a, a variety of reasons, we've lost a lot of it in our state. And it's mostly attributed to past actions of within our rivers and streams. They fill in with sediment, and a lot of that sediment has come from a lot of those past habitat egregious actions that we've been doing over the past century or two, and certainly the last few decades. Invasive species are problematic in some parts of our state more so than others. And this is just a quickie map of the known distributions of 6 non-native fish species that tend to be the most problematic for fish passage decision making. Largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, black crappie, northern pike, muskellunge, and believe it or not, walleye. These are all strong competing fishes with brook trout. They are all implicated in a variety of ways, and they function differently because they're different species. But the reality on the effect of brook trout is if any of these species show up in the river or occupied habitat, brook trout are going to leave. They're not going to stick around and subject themselves to that. And we have very few places of the state that aren't compromised with some of these competing species. Let's keep it that way. Habitat fragmentation. Barriers are everywhere. One of the things we're very proud of in the state of Maine is over the last 10 or 12 years, across a lot of effort, across multiple agencies, partners, and NGOs, you name it, we've been systematically surveying all of our road stream crossings, both public and private, statewide, and getting a much better understanding of the level of fish passability at every single one of them. It's a huge problem. We have thousands and thousands of crossings in the state, and more than half of them are problematic for brook trout passage. And this is the map I've shown here is just what we know about the public road crossings. We have comparable information for our private lands, but we don't display that because our private landowners don't necessarily want us to show that. They're good partners to work with on fixing problems, but we abide by their rules and don't share their public data with, their private data with the rest of us here in Maine. But the story is the same. It's not any different. The problem is just as bad in the private lands as it is on the public lands. And just to kind of give you an idea of how bad we're talking, this map here shows about 26,000 total surveyed crossings, public road crossings in the state. And roughly 67% of them are problematic in brook trout habitat. And by problematic, I mean they're a barrier to fish movement at some point in the year at minimum. And many of them, all those red dots are barriers 100% of the time. We have a wonderful tool to help us work with public land owners and managers and towns on the road crossing issue. It's a tool called the Mainstream Habitat Viewer, and that's the web address if anybody's curious to take a look at it further. But all of this information that's on public roads, so towns, state roads, and those private landowners that have agreed to share their data, is available for your access and information at this tool. You can look at the type of barrier it is, whether it's a road stream crossing, is it a dam? They're all ranked on passability as barriers or potential barrier, which means they're a problem at certain conditions or certain time of the year. Or the green dots are all is good and they're passable 100% of the time. And over the last 10 to 15 years, we've made great strides on the connectivity issue with many of our landowners. And it's a huge statewide focus area, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But as far as brook trout occupied habitat goes, this is a fish that needs to move extensive distances, especially as conditions change or things are changing within their own individual life history. One of the things that the EBTJV does as part of their status assessment every 10 years is they determine what are called patches. And a patch is an area of connected brook trout habitat that where brook trout can move freely within this zone through the river network. Now, at the EBTJV scale, when we're looking across the whole eastern range for the United States, they're doing this just based on the position of dams. And when you look at their data for the Penobscot watershed, our biggest watershed, we have 234 distinct brook trout patches, and the mean network length, the average length of these networks is about 66 kilometers. With the mins and max here. However, because we have all of our road stream crossings surveyed and mapped in the state of Maine, we determine what are actually called functional stream networks. And these are based on the positions of dams and culverts within the system. So this is a better reflection of reality for the fish that are out there. In our situation for the Penobscot drainage here in Maine is really we have about just under 2,000 individual habitat functional stream networks for brook trout, where the mean network length is really only just under 8 kilometers. Now compare that to what we know about how these fish actually move. And out in Western Maine with our movement studies, that fish that I showed you was actually moving 50 to 120 kilometers. And our average functional river network in the Penobscot drainage is only about 8 kilometers. So in most areas of the state, we have a lot of work to do on this connectivity issue. And this is the best of the best for brook trout in the eastern United States. So the future, where are we going with all of this? Well, we certainly have a vision for our future, and the EBTJV's vision is very similar to how we manage wild brook trout within IF&W. It's to sustain healthy fishable brook trout populations throughout the historic eastern range. And for Maine, really that means statewide, but reality is a little difficult for us to accomplish that, at least in some areas of the state. But how are we going to get there? Well, we have a variety of plans at work and in action that we are beginning or at some stage of implementation of. One of them is called the State Wildlife Action Plan. And this is a plan that the department develops on a 10-year cycle that addresses all fishery and wildlife conservation concerns. And brook trout are listed within this plan as a species of greatest conservation need. And that does not necessarily mean that we're worried about losing them. One of the goals of the Wildlife Action Plan is actually to keep our common species common across our landscape. So brook trout are listed as a species of greatest conservation need. And the goal is really to keep them as common as we possibly can across our landscape. And how are we going to do that? Well, the top ranked aquatic habitat conservation actions that were identified through that planning process are to address our stream connectivity issues, invasive species mitigation where possible, improve our resource mapping and outreach, as well as habitat restoration where we can. So this is one of the things that I do a fair amount of for inland fisheries and wildlife as I coordinate habitat restoration work for the fisheries division. And what do I mean by that is stream connectivity and fish passage, improving it at road stream crossings or maybe at dam sites where possible. Dam removal, but mostly what we're talking about here is the removal of those old log driving dams in forest lands of brook trout country. Once we find them, We work with our landowners to get rid of them, however is the easiest and fastest way to do it, as long as they're a willing partner on it. We do things in in-stream habitat restoration that facilitate pool formation to get our deep water habitats back into some of these systems. Wood addition, chop and drop is another action that we're highly active in and work cooperatively with the Maine Forest Service and our forest landowners that in conjunction with harvest activities or as part of their planning of a harvest, we add wood from the riparian area at the time of the harvest while the crews and the equipment are there. We add wood back into the stream channel to get some of those processes going again, as well as invasive species mitigation where possible. And this is a tough one because our options are extremely limited on controlling and mitigating invasive species. Best thing we can do is prevent them from occurring there in the first place. We do our best to focus efforts where we have the chance of being the most effective. And we do this through a variety of ways. But one of the things that we've done recently is put a lot of time and effort into identifying those high priority areas within the state where we have thriving wild trout populations and we have opportunities for habitat restoration or land protection strategies. So all of these purple areas in these maps, and the one on the right is just a blow up of a particular part of Maine. So you can see it a little more closely. But all those purple areas are designated areas that we call wild brook trout priority conservation areas. And this is a data set that is available to anybody who's curious or would like to know more. You can access it or download a copy of it from the Maine Office of GIS website in the Geo Library. But one of the features that is also included within identifying these streams where we would like to see conservation and habitat protection work happen for brook trout is we identify these black segments, which are areas where we're not conducive to improving stream connectivity because of invasive species issues. This particular graphic on the right is the Moose River, which is a tributary to Moosehead Lake. Moose River now has bass through a lot of sections of the main stem and many of the impoundments that comprise the Moose River system. So these black segments are highlighted as areas where we would not want to see connectivity or road stream improvements or dam removals happen because those areas are important for maintaining barriers in place for keeping the bass out from moving into those brook trout habitats. If anybody's curious, that's the area. This is the website where you can get a copy of this data set. One of the other things we're heavily involved with, because we're trying to identify where is it most likely to stay cold on our landscape in Maine in conjunction with climate change. So we are a big partner in the Mainstream Temperature Monitoring Network. We have data loggers, not just us, IF&W and all of the many partners involved with this. We have data loggers deployed all over the state in river and stream habitats. And everybody manages those loggers, downloads the data files. They're all stored in this central database. Climate modelers with the USGS then use the full database to do climate projections, basically for stream temperature changes under varying scenarios of climate change. So this graphic on the right here shows some of that output from the modeling efforts that highlight all these areas in dark purple are projected to stay cold enough or have few numbers of days per year that exceed 22 degrees C. This is what this particular graph is showing. So all those purple areas are the good areas and where things are going to continue to be okay for brook trout for now. There are a variety of scenarios that one can play with and do at that particular website. Habitat restoration work. Every year, more and more projects are planned and implemented. We have more and more of our landowners wanting to do more of this work, which I think is fantastic, and I'll work with anybody that I can. We do a fair number of wood addition projects in brook trout habitats now. It's usually in conjunction with our commercial foresters. It's called wood chop and drop, but this is just a graphic to show of some of the things that can happen in a well-designed and well-implemented wood addition project. This is the results of some monitoring work I did on the wild brook trout population in Intervale Brook a few years ago. Intervale is a tributary to First Roach Pond up in kind of the Moosehead Lake area. And Intervale as a stream, it's about 4 miles long from headwater down to the confluence with First Roach, but it's a high gradient, very channelized, rather large stream. We did a variety of things here because of the size of the stream as well as its power. It's kind of a steep stream with a lot of flow to it, and it's a steep valley, so and it gets a lot of snow in the winter, so it's a powerful stream. And it had multiple issues and had been log driven and bermed and bulldozed, and it still had the berms and the scars from all those actions in the past. So we did a variety of things over 2013 up until early 2014 or so, but some of the berms were cracked open so the stream could then reacquaint itself with its floodplain and put some meander bends back in. A lot of the boulders that were up on the banks that had been removed from the stream to facilitate the log drives of the past were put back into the stream. There was a old log driving dam that was right here in this lower picture. That was a complete barrier to fish movements, fully intact old wood dam that had been there for well over 100 years or so. We removed that and we did 2 miles of a variety of wood addition techniques down this stream. And then I started monitoring the brook trout responses to all of that. And over time, over a couple of years, our brook trout numbers ticked up in all of the sections that I was monitoring, above and below and within the treated area. And that was a great project. I would love to see more of that stuff kind of happen. As a state, the state of Maine has really gone all in on addressing our connectivity issue on our roads and streams. Road stream crossings. You may have heard about a program called Stream Smart. This is a large scale partnership program that is basically an education and outreach effort to just kind of raise awareness as well as train people responsible for road stream crossings how to do an effective or an ecologically designed replacement for that road stream crossing. Maine Audubon manages a website that contains a ton of information on how to do the right thing at a road stream crossing replacement project. There's training opportunities for people who might want to learn more, training on the environmental review process and permitting that might need to happen, who you need to talk to as far as state or federal agencies or guidance if you're looking for help. If you're interested or need funding assistance, there's often varieties of options available and information about that there. This is the place to go for anything stream crossing related. And we are making strides, although it's going to take us a while because we have many thousands to go. And this is just more information that's available at that StreamSmart website. There's all kinds of information. There's a resource library of just information in general and videos about how to actually implement a replacement project, for example, a pocket guide of the do's and don'ts of how to do a better job with a crossing replacement, and et cetera, et cetera. Oodles of information right at your fingertips. So we're all in on the connectivity front. We're making strides, and every year, quite a few. Lost track of the numbers. It's hard to keep track of them, but every year, between DOT as well as our municipal partners and private landowners, every year I'm affiliated and involved with at least somewhere between 10 and 15 individual road crossings, it seems like, which is great. Used to be none. And that's all I have for you tonight. And what we have for wild brook trout resource here in Maine and what we're doing moving into the future to conserve and protect the resource that we have, because it is spectacular here. And I like to throw this photo up at the end just to kind of throw the question out to you all of, is this degraded brook trout habitat? And some of you may recognize this site. And so that's where I will leave it. And if anybody has any questions, I'm willing to give it a go. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary. We do have some questions that came in. I'll start with some questions about salters. So one
Okay.
is a salter a subspecies of the inland brook trout, or do they just inhabit a different environment?
They're the same species, they just live in a different environment and manifest a slightly different lifestyle because they have the chance or the ability to access the estuarine habitat. So they're just a brook trout that happen to have been born in a coastal stream and have the ability to cruise into the marine world when they see fit. One thing about coastal brook trout, sea run brook trout, in our coastal streams is not all brook trout that inhabit those coastal streams will actually cruise out into the estuary. It just seems to be something that individuals do, certain individuals within the population do. There are pros and cons to that because it's a dangerous world out in the estuary. Many more predators than in their little coastal stream, but the food resources are better too. So it's kind of it's a trade off for them.
Oh, cool. Another question kind of related to biology was, what time of year do the fish transition from the young kind of shallow water habitats that they use to the overhangs and pools that they use as adults? Does that happen before the temperatures warm up in the summer?
Yeah, actually, it's more related to how old they are or what their size is. As fish grow, as brook trout grow and get larger in body size, their overall oxygen demands increase and their food demands increase. So it's more of a function of not only do you physically need deeper water because your body size is larger, but you also need to find deeper water that's cool and oxygenated enough to get you through that stressful summer season. So those young fish in their first year are usually still small enough that they stay within the riffle zones. But by that second year, they're usually big enough that they need to find someplace else when the next summer comes along.
Thank you. Let's see, someone was asking, are there other types of trout that occur in Maine?
Well, we certainly have other trout inhabiting the state, and remind ourselves that brook trout are actually a char of the genus Salvelinus, and we also have Arctic char in the state, Salvelinus alpinus. We have them occurring in 14 lakes in the state, and we also have lake trout, which are actually a char too, Salvelinus Namekush, I believe. And they're all native to the state. But we also stock brown trout and rainbow trout for sport fishery enhancement in some areas. And we do have some feral populations of brown trout that have acclimatized, have adapted to certain systems in the state and are now are present and part of the fish community there. It's not as big of a problem for us up here in Maine as other parts of brook trout habitat in the eastern United States because we simply just don't stock as many areas as many other states do. So that hasn't necessarily happened in many areas up here, but we do have them in some areas, and where they do happen, where we do have some brown trout that have adapted and are now feral in certain areas, they persist. I can't say they do well, but they persist.
So I guess that kind of feeds into a question that just came in asking if stocked species threaten brook trout.
They can. It also depends on how you do it and what you mean by threatened. Um, most people are concerned about the possibility of, say, stocked brook trout into areas where we know we have wild fish. Most people are concerned about the effects that those stockfish may have on our wild trout population if they happen to spawn together at the same time in the same place. But one of the things we know, and that would be referred to as genetic introgression. One of the things we know reasonably well about brook trout, wild brook trout especially, is they just don't seem to spawn together with stockfish if they happen to be around. There's very little evidence of introgression, true genetic introgression in our wild wild brook trout populations. And we've done some studies on this. In fact, a big study will be available publicly relatively soon on this. But there are certainly the risks of competitive ecological interactions. If you're stocking stockfish on a wild trout population, you do run the risk of those stockfish eating some of the same food resources and occupying some of the same space that those wild fish might need, especially stressful times of the year. So it's not without merit. There are concerns. We have to be careful. And I will say this, within some of the larger and very popular fishing lakes in Maine, we do stock hatchery fish. And we know we have a remnant wild brook trout component inhabiting that lake too. But the reality of the level of fishing pressure that happens at those lakes is too much for the wild fish to sustain. So we stock a lot of fish to reduce a lot of that fishing pressure on the wild fish. One of the things to also be aware of with stocked fish is they're not too bright. You know, when they come out of the hatchery, they're not the smartest individuals out there, and they often are caught at a much higher rate or easier rate than wild fish are, which are a little craftier.
Oh, neat. Someone was asking, just as connectivity is improved, what can be done to limit introgression in invasive species?
Well, I think introgression in that context, they're referring to the possibility of genetic introgression with probably stocked brook trout in other areas. The reality on that one is they just don't seem to coexist in the same space and time at spawning time between the hatchery fish and the wild fish in those areas. So introgression is actually reasonably low, very low in some areas. And but with the invasive species issue is a serious concern. And like I said, we are actually going into and doing a rather intensive thought exercise on identifying these strategic river and stream reaches where we as an agency will not be supportive of enhancing or improving connectivity in those particular areas. And it's all about limiting the ability for invasives to get up into the better brook trout habitat that's generally upstream from those areas. So we do a fair amount of that. We also, with every fish passage project that comes up in the state, whether it's a dam issue, whether we're talking dam removal or installing fish passage at dams, or it's a road stream crossing, we have to weigh these questions with every single one of them. If we have invasives already occurring both above and below the site, it's kind of a moot point. But if we have no invasives in an area, we're highly supportive of restoring connectivity and improving fish passage wherever we can. It's those strategic areas that are in that kind of Goldilocks zone, between those areas where we know we have invasive issues as well, and upstream from there tends to be our better brook trout habitats. We'll be pretty steadfast on not wanting to improve passage in those sites.
Can you talk a little bit about volunteer monitoring efforts and ways that volunteers can do things to help support brook trout?
One of the easiest and I will say funnest ways that volunteers can help us is to get involved with the stream temperature monitoring network. It's a relatively easy thing to do, but it's a lot of volunteers that are managing those individual temperature logging sites for us. And if anybody is interested in participating or joining that effort, just shoot me an email and I'll get you involved. But you know, there's always holes in the network. There's always going to be a need to get more loggers out in areas where we don't currently have any. The more loggers, the better, just in general, wherever we can get them. And it's not a huge time commitment. It's once or twice a year checking the logger at its location and making sure it's in the water, and maybe once a year downloading the data file kind of thing. That's about it. You know, but there might, you know, we don't have a whole lot of loggers available right now to lend out to people. So one of two things has to happen. We either need to get more funding for the project in general, which is something we're always working on, or if people are willing to contribute to the effort and purchase a logger or two that they manage, that's another way to go too. And we can help you on that front too. But another way that people can help is you can coordinate with your local or preferred IF&W regional fishery office and sign up to be a volunteer angling bookkeeper for us. The regional office can set you up with the materials, and it's pretty fun. You just kind of record your trip information with your fishing trips and where you go and what you caught and whether you kept it or not and what you observed while you're out there that day. And then at the end of the season, you turn the whole book back into the fishery office. We use that information gathered by our anglers to help us manage the resources that are out there.
That sounds like fun.
It is fun. And it's, you know, it is fun. You're fishing, so of course it's fun.
Yeah. We had another question about what can individual landowners do to be supportive of restoring trout habitat?
There's a lot of things landowners can do, and it does vary depending on how much land we're talking about that is under your control. But number one is if you have an undersized or poorly placed road stream crossing, come talk to me and we'll figure out a way to get it fixed in a timely fashion. I know these projects are not cheap to do, but across the state, we have a variety of options to help both on the technical assistance side as well as the funding assistance side to help landowners fix some of the problems on their ownership. The other thing to think about is managing your riparian forests and shoreline habitats a little more strategically for the benefit of fish in general. And it does vary depending where in the state you are and whether we're talking lakes and pond habitat shoreline that you have or rivers and streams. But we have a variety of suggestions for private landowners to be a little more cognizant of the fish and what they're doing on their land and to limit runoff and sedimentation issues that could be occurring that could be detrimental to the stream or the lake that you're on. And that's another thing that people can do is just if you want to do more, learn more, shoot me an email and I can point you in the direction of where to look for and get the information that's correct or pertinent for your habitat type.
Oh, great. Just a couple more questions, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Okay. One was about asking more for information about what do you do to make streams narrower and deeper in doing restoration to give more habitat and lower temperatures?
Yeah, it depends again on where you are and what kind of stream you have, because there's a variety of options. And it's a very complex matrix, actually, because we have so many different stream types in Maine and in considerations to be aware of. The best thing to do is if you're interested in learning more, if you think you have a stream that would benefit from restoration action, is to contact me. And I very likely, depending on where you are and the type of stream we're talking about, I'd set up a day that I'd come out and actually look at the stream and we talk about options that might be available to you. None of them are quick or easy, just so you know. It's a planning and lengthy process, and it may could sometimes, depending on the recommended action, it could take years to actually get to implementation. So just be aware of that. None of these fixes are quick.
We had a question from someone asking if it would be unlikely that brook trout would be in a cove off the Damascata where it's brackish water.
It's possible because I know that historically sea run and coastal trout did occur in that area. It's just questionable based on the conditions and the temperatures that seem to be kind of the issue in that part of the coast now. I'm not sure if it's likely anymore. And also within that Damascata area, at least in the lakes and ponds in that area, there's a fair amount of brook trout stocking that goes on. some of those fish may drop down into the estuary. You never know. So there's always the chance that you could catch one out there. You just might not know readily if it's a stocked fish drop down from one of the lakes or ponds, or if it's a truly wild fish. Um, just as an FYI, we don't necessarily, most of our stocked fish are fin clipped, but not all. But almost all stocked fish, even if they're not fin clipped, if you look closely, they have eroded fins, and some of their fins just look rough from being in the hatchery raceways before they were stocked out. So that's one thing you can do if you're curious to see if you might have a truly wild estuarine fish, is to look at that fin condition and take it from there. But it's not 100%, just to let you know.
We had a couple people commenting with thoughts about the picture.
Okay.
Their ideas were yes, that it seems too wide and shallow and it sort of looks straightened. And then someone else noted that there wasn't any wood or boulders in the stream.
Correct.
Can you tell us more about the stream?
I absolutely can. And I like to show this photo because it's actually not as degraded as many other areas of our state, but this was a heavily log driven stream for many decades. This is Southahunk Stream in the heart of Baxter State Park. And Baxter State Park is the parcel of land that has been in long-term land conservation and protection longer than any other parcel in the state. And we still see this degraded stream habitat condition even in Baxter Park. It's over-widened, shallow in many areas with little to no in-stream structure. You got it. And when you actually walk this stream, you actually can see pulpwood logs still embedded in the sediments along the stretch of this stream. So this is but the other kind of good things about this stream is there's no invasive species, and it's a cold stream. It's super cold, and it's a great thermal habitat for fish, and it supports a thriving wild brook trout population, and they're beautiful. If you ever get a chance to fish Southahunk, give it a go because you won't be disappointed. Can't guarantee you'll catch one, but if you do, it's going to be a beautiful fish. But this is just to show that this chronic, over-widened, shallow condition with little to no in-stream structure and pools is everywhere, even in our parcel of land that has been protected the longest.
Mary, I think our last question for the night is, what's your favorite place to visit or fish for trout in Maine?
I'll be honest, I'm a terrible angler. I don't have any time to dedicate to it. It's on my list of things to do when I retire is to actually take up and be a serious angler again. I have many favorite places. But I have to say Southahunk is one of them, Baxter State Park in general, because the fish are beautiful up in there. But there are beautiful fish in many areas of the state. Another beautiful area is Cobscook Bay. And there are many streams that drain into Cobscook Bay that support thriving wild brook trout populations. And one of the things that we'd like to know more about is, just how many or how many of those populations out there are supporting a coastal or sea run component. How many of those fish are actually cruising out into the estuary itself and maybe cruising around? It's a big question that I have as well as many others. So maybe soon we'll be able to do something out there. We'll see. If you haven't been out to Cobscook, go. It's beautiful.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so much knowledge tonight and your presentation. This was really wonderful.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing here. I realized I should have done that a while ago. But this was fun. Thank you for the opportunity, and get out and go fishing and look at some beautiful fish and take some good photos. But get them back in the water quickly, unless you're keeping them.
Well, thanks. Good night, all.
All right.